Out of curiosity, by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with that term, delegitimization of Israel? Okay, so, you know, a few of you, not everybody, which is great that you're all in the room and you're about to find out from, I think, maybe the best person who can talk to you about it. Bret Stephens writes the Wall Street Journal's Global View column on foreign affairs, which runs every Tuesday in the U.S. and is also published in the European and Asian editions of the paper. He is the deputy editorial page editor, responsible for the editorial pages of the Asian and European editions of the paper, the columnists on foreign affairs, and the Far Eastern Economic Review. Mr. Stephens was the youngest ever editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed at age 28. At the Post, he was responsible for the paper's news and editorial divisions. He also wrote a weekly column. In 2004, Mr. Stephens was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, where he's also a media fellow. Raised in Mexico City and educated at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics, Mr. Stephens is married and has 3 children. And we are very honored to have you here tonight, and he'll be speaking to you and then taking questions at the end.
Well, thank you for that really nice introduction, which is mostly untrue, but I'll take it anyway. I have to admit that I only heard about the term BDS like in the last 6 months or so. And I was giving a speech at, I think, an APAC event, and some woman came up to me and she said, "What do you think about BDS?" And you know, I thought like maybe I'm a little behind the times. It sounded like a sex act. What do I think about BDS? Well, I don't know. You know? What do you think about BDS? I thought to myself, maybe I should go back home, suggest BDS to my wife, and but then there would have been boycott, divestment, and sanctions in my bedroom. So it's a good thing I didn't. So that was my introduction to BDS, which is really the latest term of art for a long-standing campaign of delegitimization. Rebecca mentioned that earlier. That's been going on against Israel since even before it was created. People think that the Arab League's boycott of Israel began with the creation of the state and what they claim is the Nakba, the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians by force. In fact, the Arab League's boycott of Israel begins several years earlier as a boycott of Jewish businesses in British Mandate Palestine. So there's a long campaign. In the 1970s, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution claiming that Zionism was a form of racism, one of the most shameful acts in the UN's history, although that's a kind of crowded, competitive field. You could spend a lot of time sort of debating what's the worst thing that the UN has done. And I just note en passant that one of the many reasons I love what's happening in Libya is to see the UN's Human Rights Commission suddenly deciding that it should suspend Libyan membership. How did Libya become a member of the UN Human Rights Commission in the first place? So at any rate, this forms part of a long-standing picture, and people who have been writing about Israel have been dealing with this campaign under one name or another for a very long time. So, you go and speak with these young people, and inevitably it's like, speeches organized by Hillel or the University Students for Israel or whatever, and then you always get some segment from a Palestinian Solidarity campaign, and, I talk to these young kids, and they are not, at least they don't think they're out to stand up for a movement that is fundamentally illiberal, fundamentally fellow traveling with some of the most totalitarian movements in the world today. They think they're acting on behalf of justice. And so I find myself engaging with them. And I think there's some utility in realizing that the BDS campaign, in terms of the people who are in it, isn't so different from, quote, progressive or very left-wing communist movements from the generation of my father and grandfather, in which the leadership of the movement stands for a certain set of things, mainly seizing power, ruining other people's lives. But most of the people who are in the campaign do so with a certain purity of motive and definitely convinced of their own purity of motive. And if you're going to deal with them, you have to deal with them on that basis. Instead of attacking their motives, you have to take what are their principles and use them, in a sense, against them, at least rhetorically, if you're going to start to win some of these people over. Now, I give tons of speeches on campuses, and I also listen to a lot of people attempting to make what they think is the best case for Israel. And generally what I find is that people who are Israel's declared, or at least self-declared spokesmen, or spokeswomen, make a really lousy case. It doesn't entirely explain, or doesn't even come close to fully explaining the animus against Israel, but it certainly doesn't help either that our side is not really served well by the people who attempt or claim to speak for us. And let me give you a few examples of what I mean by that. Why does Israel have a right to exist? Because Jews have been in that land for 3,000 years. Okay. It happens to be true. There's a mountain, literally mountains of archaeological evidence testifying to continuous Jewish presence in the land for over 3,000 years. It's absolutely important for those of us, why are we in Israel? Why are Jews in Israel as opposed to Uganda or Sitka, Alaska? It's because there's a connection to that particular piece of land. That's important. But it's also worth noting that there's a long-standing Palestinian connection to that piece of land. And there are long-standing connections on the part of all kinds of groups. I mean, there's a Crusader connection, a Christian connection, going back to the 11th century. When you start to make the purely ethnic or purely Jewish case for why Israel has a right to exist, you kind of run into an immediate roadblock, because then your opponents say, well, what about the other people who are there? Don't they have a right? And then you're sort of faced rhetorically with two choices. One of them is to say, yes, but we have a greater right because we were there, presumably, before, which is difficult to prove and in any case irrelevant. And the other choice is to say, well, yes, I guess we both have rights to the land, and therefore we should share them. Now, that's also perfectly fine, and in a sense I agree with that. But from the standpoint of rhetoric, the best that argument gets you, the furthest that argument gets you, is to a position of stalemate. We have rights, you have rights. Let's find a way to divide those rights. Okay, so that doesn't get you very far. The next argument that I come across all the time, and which drives me bananas, is that Israelis are more victimized than Palestinians. So during the last war over Gaza in 2009, you had a lot of Jews going and saying, look at what's happening in Sderot. Constant rocket attacks in Sderot. And it's true. I mean, it was unbelievable, the level of misery that was inflicted on this little village at the edges of Gaza. But if you finally look at the raw numbers, again, the Palestinians come back and say, well, look, in this war, Palestinian rockets killed, I don't know, a dozen Israelis, and yet Israeli bombs killed hundreds of Palestinians. And when you sort of look at it in that sort of simple mathematical equation, the Palestinians always come out winners in the game of victimization. Now, that bothers me on a whole number of levels, not the least of which is I don't think that Israel wants to make its case constantly on the grounds that it is the more victimized nation. What should Israel do? Sustain greater casualties so that it can win that particular argument? That's an insane argument. But the point isn't really ultimately about who is being more victimized, at least numerically. Again, that is a complete dead end. By the way, I should mention just in passing that when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, you saw these figures, 1,000 Israelis killed in the Intifada versus 3,000 Palestinians killed in the Intifada. And I asked an Arab member of my staff to go through a list of every single Palestinian who had been killed and check off the names of those Palestinians who were women. I was just curious, and including those names which go either way. So I was generous with these assumptions. And I found out that something that was really quite remarkable. Of all the Palestinians killed, and these were names I'd gotten from a Palestinian source, the JMCC, of all the Palestinians who had been allegedly killed by Israeli fire, 2% of those people were women. But of all the Israelis killed, the number was well in excess of a quarter. Now, if Israelis were firing indiscriminately at Palestinians, right, just bombing from the air, not caring what the target is, you would expect some ratio that was much closer to a 50-50 ratio, commensurate with the natural population. How is it that the Israeli army, which is allegedly firing indiscriminately at Palestinians, only manages to hit women 2% of the time? Anyway, that's another story. But the argument, by argument via victimization is a terrible argument. Israel didn't come into this into existence to be the most victimized nation in the world, and it's one that people shouldn't make. Another argument that people often trot out, which again drives me bananas because it's such a dead end, is, well, Israel is a democracy, right? Israel is a democracy surrounded by dictatorships. And in fact, Israel is a democracy surrounded by dictatorships, except the Palestinians held an election in 2005 and 2006. And it happens that they elected, well, first they elected Abu Mazen, who's now run beyond his term, but then they elected Hamas. So you actually don't have a case, at least on the surface, of one democratic Israel versus a sea of dictatorships. You have two democracies. Now, democracy doesn't get you very far in an argument, because when you start making the case from the standpoint of democracy, you have to say, well, what are the values that inform that democracy? Hitler was also elected democratically. All kinds of bad people are elected democratically. And as a matter of fact, one of the justifications that Hamas uses for perpetrating terror attacks on Israeli civilians is they say that because Israel elected these governments, the Israeli citizenry is just as responsible for the actions of the government as the government itself. So the argument from democracy is a very problematic argument in a whole number of ways. And it's one, by the way, that's going to work even less well if we start to see, say, an Egypt under a democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood, or a Jordan, or in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which has made huge democratic inroads. So making this argument from the standpoint of democracy is a really bad case. Another mistake that pro-Israel spokesmen make is to say Israel is just a fantastic country, and just to defend everything that Israel does. It's just, a totally superlative country. Now, I love Israel. I just returned from Israel yesterday afternoon. Every time I go back there, I feel fantastic and great. But Israel is a country that's composed of ordinary mortals, some of whom are jerks. And that goes for young men in the army. Israel is not a country that doesn't have a single pimple on it. It's not. And when you start to defend Israel that way by sort of pointing to all of its virtues, you're painting a picture of a country that doesn't actually exist. That's not to say that you can't be proud of the country for producing all kinds of things that are remarkable and amazing and wonderful, but it's a dangerous argument to engage in, because you come out sounding effectively like a naive person, and you also come out sounding out of tune with a lot of Israelis who, the moment you go there, will be the first to tell you that the government is dysfunctional, the former president was a rapist, the former prime minister is an indicted shyster. Just go down the list, and you get it also from B'Tselem and all these Israeli human rights groups. The Israeli army has done this, the settlers have done that, and so forth and so on. So that's a bad argument, to make. And the final argument that drives me insane is, when there's let's say there's a terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. When I lived in Israel, there were terrorist attacks literally three times a week, 4 or 5 of them in about a 200-yard, 300-yard radius of my apartment. And you'd have this situation in which there'd be a terrorist attack, and CNN would go to a screen, and they'd ask the Israeli spokesman, Ranan Gieson or Alon Pinkas or whoever, they'd say, "What do you make of this, Mr. Spokesman?" And he'd say, "Well, this just shows that the Palestinians, continue to commit terrorism. And as we all know, terrorism is very bad." Right? Yeah. And the Palestinian guy would say, "We condemn the violence on all sides, but you're still stealing our land." Now, every time that happened, the Palestinian won the argument, because you had an asymmetric argument. You had an Israeli guy who was talking about means, and then you had a Palestinian guy who was talking about ends. When you have that asymmetry, the proverbial man from Mars is always going to side with the person talking about ends. Because with the Palestinian, the power of the Palestinian case is to say, you have been sitting for years, 43 years. This is our house, and you invaded it. You're squatting on our land. So, yeah, we're sorry about the terrorism, but you can understand, or some people might understand, why some segment of our population has gone a little bit berserk here. Palestinians are always going to win that argument. And yet these arguments that I just mentioned are the ones that I suspect at least some of you have at one point or another made in the course of trying to argue for Israel. Or at least if it isn't you, it's a lot of people who are associated with the pro-Israel side. So I don't want to talk, forever. I'd like to mainly take questions on any subjects, but I want to talk a little bit about some of, what I think are really smarter, better arguments to make. Let me begin with what I just mentioned, that asymmetry about when it comes to Israelis talking about terrorism versus Palestinians talking about occupation. The point that the Israeli spokesman needs to make isn't you're committing terrorism. The point is, why are you committing this terrorism, and why is it that such a large segment of the Palestinian population is committed not to building a state of their own, but to destroying our state? Why is it that poll after poll of Palestinians shows that a majority of them continue to believe that the only just solution to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is a one-state solution, effectively Palestinian, from the river to the sea? People don't look at this data, but it's out there. The University of Liverpool did an extensive survey of this, which showed that while something like 17 or 18% of Israelis believe that the final outcome of any agreement with the Palestinians has to be an Israel that's from the river to the sea, that it's essential, that you'd have to flip those numbers. It's, I think, 81% of Palestinians believe that that has to be the outcome. And it's not just among the Palestinian people. When Palestinian leaders talk about, we need a final agreement which includes the status of the refugees, what they're talking about is resettling 2, 3, 4 million people in Israel itself. You go to groups like Palestinian Media Watch, and they will provide you with mountains of evidence that this is what Palestinians continue to believe. Now, my grandmother was kicked out of Russia and then Germany, and I would gladly reclaim my place on the Russian throne and the rest of my Romanov inheritance and the apartments in Berlin. That doesn't happen for the rest of the world's refugees. But the Palestinians have continued to insist on it, and of course, every time they insist on it, they can count on the fact that 85 to 95% of any Western audience has no idea what they're talking about. No clue what it means when they talk about the refugee situation. Now, connected to that is this concept of the occupation. A lot of people say, yeah, Israel's a terrific country. We're all for Israel. It's great, great place, wonderful. Tel Aviv, great city. But you have to end the occupation. I was on TV. I was debating David Remnick, who is the editor of the New Yorker. And Remnick had just come back from a trip from Israel, and he said, but Bret, this occupation, it's just so corrosive. It's just eating away at Israel's soul. And he says it in this kind of pathetic way of his. But the style of I felt like, as he was speaking, I felt there were little umlauts in his diction. And I said, David, I agree. The occupation is bad. I wish there weren't an occupation. I wish it could end tomorrow. But for Israel, the question is, what happens the day after the occupation ends? You're assuming that the moment the occupation ends, as you see it in your Western terms, the conflict ends. But when Israel's occupation of Gaza ended once and for all in the fall of 2000 and the late summer of 2005, what happened wasn't peace. Gaza didn't decide that it was going to show the world what the Palestinians would do with some land of their own. Or maybe they did decide they would show the world what they would do with some land of their own. But instead of turning it into a little, Singapore or a little Hong Kong, they turned it into a terrorist entrepot, a staging ground for constant missile and rocket attacks on Israel. So why should the Israelis have any confidence that if they give back an even greater and strategically more significant segment of land, that they're not going to get something like Gaza, but on a vastly greater scale? The fundamental point is that much as we'd like to believe that Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is territorial and therefore can be solved by territorial means, fundamental conflict is existential, at least from the point of view of the Palestinians. Palestinians remain overwhelmingly committed to seeing through the destruction of Israel. And until it becomes a purely territorial dispute, then you're going to continue to have a basic problem, whether there's an occupation or not. So people say, well, are you against a two-state solution? No, I'm 100% in favor of a two-state solution. Two-state solution is ultimately in Israel's best interest. But a two-state solution under what conditions? A two-state solution where the other side is like Canada, like a nice little country that, is pleasant to visit. Or a two-state solution where the other state is a terrorist state, the tip of an Iranian spear, dominated by a group like Hamas, whose charter calls not only for the destruction of Israel, but for the eradication of Jewry in the Holy Land. If that's the case, I'm willing to wait until we have better conditions to create a two-state solution. Now, another point, which I think is important to mention, it happened for reasons that I don't quite understand, but on my flight over to Israel, I was reading a book about Zimbabwe. This Jewish Zimbabwean journalist, Peter Godwin, went back to his home country. He'd been born in what was then called Rhodesia. Then after the end of white rule, it became Zimbabwe. Went back in 2008 to write a story about what were then the elections, which Mugabe stole. And what's happening in Zimbabwe is just unbelievable. I mean, it's just, you have an entire country that is effectively being deliberately starved by one of the most kleptocratic, repressive, and brutish leaders in the world today. It's an absolute horror show. Now, whenever I go to speak to college campuses and I find myself talking with students from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign or whatever, I like to say to them, I say, it's great, you care for justice in Palestine. Fantastic. When was the last time you decided that you were going to picket outside of Zimbabwe's mission to the UN or its embassy in the United States? Aren't you upset that Mugabe, until relatively recently, was winning accolades and honorary accolades from the Queen of England and honorary degrees from places like the University of Michigan? Where's your compassion for the people of Zimbabwe? Why aren't you picketing on their behalf? And while we're talking about this same subject, during the 10 years in which Israel has been more or less fighting some version or another of the Intifada of the Palestinians, that is the last 10 years, Russia has killed about 200,000 people in Chechnya. Now, Chechnya is a little Muslim enclave in southern Russia that wants to be independent. Has about 1 million people in it or so. Some of these people are hardcore terrorists, but a lot of them are just innocent civilians. And Russia has absolutely brutalized Chechnya. Think about it. If, according to estimates, Russia has killed 200,000 Chechens out of a population of 1 million. 1 out of every 5 murdered by Russia. It's just a campaign of obliteration against Chechnya. Okay? If you make the worst case assumption about Israel and what it has done vis-a-vis the Palestinians over the same time period, Israel has killed about 4,000 Palestinians. I find myself asking them, why aren't you equally upset about what's happening in Chechnya? Have you decided on a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Russia? If so, what's the difference? Because what's happening in Chechnya is infinitely worse than what's happening in Palestine. So that's another point that needs to be made. That's not to say, oh, you shouldn't care about Palestine. By all means care about Palestine. But care about Palestine in proportion to the scheme of the world's crimes. Because there are greater crimes being committed as we speak. And the truth is that with all your obsession about the Palestinians, you haven't lifted a finger for anybody else. Well, that's a point that I think is important. Another thing worth mentioning here, there's no substitute for actually having information at your disposal. And one of the ways in which Israel haters operate is they bombard you with quote-unquote facts. The historian Richard Hofstadter once wrote an essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which most of you don't remember, but all of you read it in college, I'm sure, because it's like, standard to read this piece. And one of the things he pointed out was that paranoid, sort of lunatic fringe types always engage in what they call facticity. So if you talk to someone who's obsessed with the idea that, say, 9/11 was some inside job, they'll always have this bizarre information well, why was it that Tower 7, came down, and if you look at it structurally, they go on and on and on. The Palestinians are masters at facticity too. You'd always hear Yasser Arafat saying, what about this UN resolution and that UN resolution? They kind of throw these things at you, and it was hard to keep track of the various resolution numbers, and you felt like the guy was talking from some basis of fact. And then you get the idea, well, Israel is an apartheid state. Well, Israel is a country with 120,000 black people in it, Ethiopians. So all of these people are citizens. All of these people, or at least their parents, were rescued from atrocious conditions in Ethiopia at the height of the famine there in the 1980s. Israel is a country with 75,000 Indians in it. People don't talk about this. 75,000 Indians. And Israel is also a country with 800,000 Jews, and actually more by now, but originally about 800,000 Jews of Middle Eastern descent. Israel is also a country in which there are 11 members of parliament who are Arabs. Now, Egypt, which has a population of, whose population is about 15 to 20% Coptic Christian, has a parliament that until recently had one Coptic Christian member of parliament, despite it being 15 or 20% of the population. How do you have an apartheid state in which you have genuine Arab representation in government? Where exactly is the apartheid nature of that point? So these things have to be, this kind of information has to be kind of available to you, because if it isn't, you just kind of find yourself saying, well, no, I don't think it's an apartheid state, but you don't really know what it is that you want to say. Another thing that I think is very important is we have to get away from what I call the A+ versus D- standard of judging Israel. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, when people are so keen on defending Israel as this perfect state that never does anything wrong. Last year, after that business with the Turkish flotilla, where the Israeli commandos landed on the ship, they were set upon by extremists on the ship, and then 9 of these extremists were killed by the commandos. I was very struck by the Jewish reaction to what happened. The Arab reaction, the UN reaction, all that was totally predictable. This is genocide, this is Auschwitz all over again, the usual crap. But the Jewish view was, this is a disgrace. Why didn't we have better intelligence? Why didn't we stop the ships when they, approached Cyprus? Why didn't our commandos find a way to disable the rudder? It was basically the idea is Israel is this country of supermen, right? And so anything less than Superman behavior is a sign of total and complete failure, state dysfunction. Okay? That is the standard to which not only the rest of the world holds Israel, it's we Jews often find ourselves holding Israel at some point to that standard too. So it's an A+ standard. Anything less than an A+, it's like a pass-fail scheme in which you either get an A+ or you fail the course. Now take a country like Iran, okay? Busily government stealing the election, murdering its own people, hostaging foreign nationals, for the sake of and using them as bargaining tools. Recently, disappearing the leading 2 former presidential candidates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So today I was shocked, and I sent a news site. Well, actually, since I'm on camera, I'm not going to attack my own paper. But I often hear people describe a guy like Rafsanjani, Ali Hashemi Rafsanjani, the former president of Iran, as a moderate. Okay? Why is he moderate? Because he's opposed to Ahmadinejad in this kind of internal scheme of Iranian politics. Now, Rafsanjani happened to have been president in the 1990s, where, among other things, he was responsible for ordering the bombing of the Jewish Cultural Center in Buenos Aires. And for that, there's an Interpol arrest warrant on his, in his name. Rafsanjani was also notorious for murdering, sending his goon squads to murder dissidents, suppress dissent, all the rest of it. In fact, he was so bad that when his successor was elected, this guy Khatami, Khatami was welcomed as this, great reformist candidate after the sort of darkness of the Rafsanjani years. Now you have the situation in which suddenly a guy like Rafsanjani is a moderate within the scheme of Iranian politics. And more broadly, whenever Iranians decide, well, maybe we'll have a parlay in Geneva or Istanbul about our nuclear portfolio, the world says, oh, you see, this is evidence of Iranian moderation. So why is Iran always getting this pass from the international community? They do the smallest thing, and we're saying, oh, well, maybe they're improving. Well, the reason is simple. It's a matter of assumptions. If you expect everything of someone, you're going to forgive nothing of them. And if you expect nothing of someone, you're going to forgive everything of them. And that has been the systematic way in which Israel has been treated vis-a-vis its neighbors, at least in small part because we treat Israel as a country that can do no wrong. And so when it does do something wrong, we treat it not just as a mistake, but as a crime. And we have to move away from that. We have to insist, you were talking about, what's my Zionism? Zionism for me is the concept of Jewish possibility. And Jewish possibility has to be premised on some idea of Jewish imperfection. And that's a reality we need to think about. Let me make two other points and then turn it over to questions. One of the things that I find very disturbing, not least because I'm an op-ed writer for a conservative editorial page, and this kind of criticism you often find coming from the political right, is that American soldiers are dying in the Middle East basically at the behest, if not explicitly at the behest, but at least in the interests of Israel. And you saw this, there was a controversy with David Petraeus last year in which he said something that mildly suggested this idea. Pat Buchanan says this even more strongly. We're sending our boys to die in Kabul so that the Likud can get its way. And you hear this a lot. I'm amazed by this argument, and I'm amazed that it's not rebutted more often. American soldiers have died for the sake of Iraqis, Afghans, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Somalis, Bosnians, Kosovars, all Muslims. Not a single American soldier has ever died for Israel. Not a single American soldier has ever died to defend Israel. It's an absolute statement of fact. Israel defends itself. That case has to be made, that one of the reasons we like Israel as an ally is because it is a self-reliant nation. And yes, we do help it with $3 billion of aid, but they put that aid to very good use because we don't have to save their kosher bacon every few years, the way we have to go and save Saudi Arabia from Iran or from Iraq or save other countries and really put lives at risk. Final point, this is a point I make to every audience I speak to, so if you've heard me speak before, you'll hear me say it again, but it's important. And it's particularly important in the case of the boycott, the BDS campaign. People who are in the BDS campaign all consider themselves liberals and progressives. All of them, or almost all of them. It is a movement that's coming politically from the left. There are some exceptions, but basically it's coming from the left. Now this is astonishing to me. It's astonishing because the most powerful case that anyone can make for Israel is the liberal case for Israel. Now, you heard me speak earlier about how I can't stand this point in which people say Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, therefore it's worthy of our support. I don't like that case because when you speak of democracy, you're speaking about a process, but you're not actually addressing fundamental values, ideals. It's just a mechanism. But you have to defend Israel. You can defend Israel by speaking directly to values. I meet with these college students. I say, how many of you are in favor of gay rights? They all raise their hands. Fantastic. Me too. How many of you are opposed to don't ask, don't tell? They all raise their hands. Great. Wonderful. Fabulous. Me too. How many of you believe that women should have the same choices and opportunities in life as men do? Well, good. 100% unanimity there. All right. How many of you think that if you're an artist, you have a right to offend not only the aesthetic, but the moral sensibilities of your audience? All hands go up. Free press, you're for that? Yeah? Good. Speaking truth to power. Fabulous. What about politicians if they're accused of a crime of some kind, that they should be held accountable for those crimes? They all raise their hands. It's fabulous. How many of you are opposed to the death penalty? Most hands go up. Fabulous. Fantastic. How many of you think that minorities should be represented in government? They all raise their hands. How many of you consider yourselves environmentalists? Do you consider that environmental stewardship is a really fundamental obligation of any serious advanced government? People should care about the land and the quality of the land and the air and the sea. They all raise their hand. At that point I say, look, those are your values. The only country in the Middle East that supports them is Israel. Because you don't find gay rights in Palestine. In fact, you find a terrorized gay community in Palestine. You don't find women's rights in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, if a woman is raped, she's the one who's punished. You don't find rights of artistic and cultural expression in Iran. It's completely censored. You don't find minority representation in most of the Middle East. Look at what's happening in Bahrain, where the government is Sunni, and 85% of the country is Shiite. Go down the list. At that point, you say, look, it's very simple. If you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or a sympathizer with it, you don't like Israel, I can't persuade you. It's theological. We have our differences. But if you're a liberal and a progressive, and the only country that you oppose and you think is illegitimate is Israel, then you're either a fool or a hypocrite. That case has to be made again and again. It's such a simple, easy, low-hanging fruit type of case to make. So I think that if we can do this, if we can basically up our game, we're not going to persuade the people who really hate us, the people who lead the BDS campaigns, who are in it for disingenuous motives. But you can start to turn the conversation with for a generation of people for whom hating Israel is like a fashion statement. You can get them to say, you know, the clothes that you're wearing that you think are so great, actually, they look like shit. You look stupid and foolish. And you don't really want to be wearing that. You don't want to be seen looking like that, saying those things, because you'll come to regret it. If you can make that case in a friendly way, in a persuasive way, I think that we're going to start to turn this thing around. So on that note, thank you.
Yell your question really loud so we get it and everyone can hear it.
Just touch on briefly like the BDS campaign in the United States and how a lot of funding is coming from the European Union and foreign governments, and maybe what ordinary people like us can do about it, what our government should be doing about it.
You know, you should ask Gerald Steinberg that question because I don't really follow it that closely. Ultimately, it's hard to track these funding flows, and it seems to me, you know, there are plenty of movements that are extremely well funded, but the funding doesn't really influence the success of the argument. So I have no idea whether the EU is sponsoring any part of it. I mean, you see it from time to time in the work of certain academics who are prominent Israel haters, and then it turns out they're giving, you know, they're making $75,000 per speech in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. So, you know, no surprises there. But again, I'm sort of loath even to accept the premise of the question, which is to say the power of the BDS campaign stems from the idea that these guys are just really loaded, because in a way it's a kind of mirror image of the accusation that's made of the pro-Israel movement, that, you know, I'm speaking here on behalf of Israel because, you know, the network of my influential Zionist friends is paying me mountains of money to do that. No, it's not. Well, it's not paying me mountains of money, A. But B, I would speak, I shouldn't say this, but I would be speaking on behalf of Israel even if I weren't being paid mountains of money. It has nothing, the financial aspect doesn't really inform the fundamental sense of conviction at work here. And so I think it's, you know, there's a side of Jewish life that's always examining this stuff, like who's giving money to J Street and all the rest of it. And, you know, the idea that maybe J Street has some Arab donors is dispositive proof of their malice and ill intentions. I don't want to make that argument against J Street. They have to get money from wherever they can get money. And if, whether it's George Soros or Sheikh whatever, then fine. Where they have to be challenged really is at the level of ideas.
I appreciate very much you taking the time to speak.
So the first time I went to Israel, well, I went to Israel as a child. I have some relatives over there. But the second time I went to Israel, I stayed on a kibbutz with my obnoxious, petty, horrible relatives. Literally just hated every minute of the experience. I was like 16 or 17 years old. And just to make my point, when I got out of JFK, I think I was 16, my mother was there to pick me up at the airport. I made a point of wearing a keffiyeh and like a full kaftan and Ray-Ban sunglasses. So I wasn't always quite so pro-Israel. I'll tell you briefly how it really began. I mean, I've always been interested in these issues, and despite my kibbutz experience, I was always essentially sympathetic to Israel. But when I was, the first time I went to work for the Wall Street Journal, I was sent to Europe, where I was supposed to be writing about regulatory issues for the European Union. This was in 2000. At the time, the guy who used to write about Israel for the journal's editorial page returned to the States. So I was kind of handed the job of just being the guy writing these editorials. And right after the failure of Camp David, I was asked by my editor to fly out, really not so much to Israel, but to the Palestinian Authority, because Arafat was threatening to declare a state on September 13th of that year, which was the 7th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords. And so my assignment was, what kind of state is it going to be if he declares one? So instead of sort of doing the usual route of the settlements, Israelis, et cetera, I tried to see things through a really purely Palestinian lens. So I spent a lot of time in Gaza, in Jenin, Ramallah, interviewed all kinds of people, Hamas, all these characters. And the impression that I came away with was that this was a kleptocratic, dysfunctional, sclerotic state that was breeding fanatics and fanaticism and encouraging it, and that the peace process was about to explode. And I wrote that in a piece that appeared 9 days before the Second Intifada began. It was called Palestine, the Dream and the Nightmare. And then 9 days later, of course, it erupts, and then I became really interested in the topic. One other thing happened, which is I was based in Brussels at the time, so I returned to Brussels from Israel. Intifada breaks out, and I'm this like curious character because my name is Stephens, but weirdly I'm Jewish. I mean, my grandfather just decided he wanted the blandest Anglo-Saxon name he could think of, and that's what he came up with, Stephens. And so I was privy to conversations among journalists, like, in Brussels, it's like you just go hang out with other guys. And I was astonished by the kind of conversations that they were having, in which Israel was not only to blame for the Intifada. A lot of people thought that. Thanks, man. Not only to blame, but that it was essentially this idea of, well, what a French ambassador once said, this shitty little country that was sending the world careening towards war. I mean, there was just a lot of basically naked anti-Semitism written into that criticism. People just would say this to me not knowing that I was Jewish. And so that was an animating force. So I just became obsessed with the topic and started going out there all the time. I was in Israel on September 11th. I learned of the attacks from the passport control people. First time ever in my life that I've had people have been pleasant to me at the Israeli airport, at Ben Gurion Airport, was when, because you go on, you're a journalist, were you going to Ramallah? And so they're usually treated with total hostility. And that night, I spent my time wandering between East and West Jerusalem. And in East Jerusalem, there was a look of just utter glee. Like, Arafat tried to tamp it down, but I don't know if any of you were around here when the OJ verdict came down in the mid-'90s. I remember that day where clearly you were like, oh my God, there are these two countries here, totally different reactions to what had happened. Well, that was my point of reference on 9/11 to what happened. You go to East Jerusalem, it's like people were fantastic. Yeah, it's great. And then on the western side, just a sense of huge loss and fear. And so that too had something to do with my education.
You shared a lot of knowledge and information with us tonight. I think for a lot of us this is new information. It's great that we're learning and we're kind of becoming empowered to share this information with others. So where can we go to get the facts, to have the right knowledge? How can we, empower ourselves to have these kinds of conversations?
Well, if you have a subscription to the journal, get a second subscription to the journal. Look, there are a lot of sources, and it's just important to read widely. I wish I could say just read, I don't know, Martin Gilbert's books on Israel, or Michael Oren's 6 Days of War, or Abe Rabinovich's book on the Yom Kippur War. Joan Peters wrote this book from time immemorial about the origins of the 48 War. All those are terrific books. It's worthwhile going, as I do on a regular basis, to the MEMRI website, memri.org, which is basically a translation service of what is in the Arab or Muslim world's media, which is fascinating. Really, really interesting to see what the conversation they're having in Arabic or Urdu or Farsi. I find the Israeli media pretty unreliable because there's I don't know, I read stuff in the Israeli media and I think, well, that might be true. But there's a lot of mediocrity in Israeli journalism as well. So I have to take that with a grain of salt. I mean, most of what I do and learn I get in a way that it's probably not available to you, which is from primary sources. And I just talk to a lot of people. We get a lot of interesting visitors coming in who I meet with, not just from Israel, but from the Arab world at large. And all of that is reflected in that fabulous column I write every Tuesday. And can I tell you?
Two questions. One is, when I speak to Muslims and Arabs, the story that I usually get from them is actually one of the mentions that the Jews were never in the Middle East whatsoever. Yeah. All the Jews are somewhere in Ukraine. And then at some point, usually they all decided to move to Israel, but they're all related to Khazars. There's always like some stories about how the ancient Jews disappeared and now the modern Jews. And the more I talk to Muslims, the more I realize that this narrative is in the Muslim world. So the first question is, is this a story that you've heard of, or a narrative that you've heard, and how would you respond to it? And
okay, so yeah, I mean, look, the concept of the Khazars came from Arthur Kessler, who otherwise was an interesting guy, but it's a crackpot theory. And now you have this book, Shlomo Sand, The Invention of the Jewish People, which is the same kind of deal. Yasser Arafat, there's one of the things that, first of all, this belief is pervasive. And in fact, Yasser Arafat once told Bill Clinton, I have to tell you, I don't think the Jews were ever in Palestine. And you know what Bill Clinton said? So who exactly was Jesus? So his undying credit. That was Bill's response. There is this narrative, but the deeper point actually about that narrative is a fundamental problem, which is what you might call the closing of the Muslim mind. After the suicide bombing of the Coptic church in Alexandria, the narrative in the Egyptian press across the board, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but secular, so-called liberal writers, even Coptic Christian writers, was that this was a Zionist plot. And there were two competing theories. One was that the Mossad directly had bombed the church. And the second was that Al-Qaeda was operationally under the control of the Mossad. And the Mossad had sent Al-Qaeda to do this and therefore divide Egyptians and crack national unity, et cetera, et cetera. This is very worrying because you have, when you sort of listen to the debates in the Muslim world, it's like both sides are cracked. You talk to people who describe themselves as liberals, and everything for them is this fanatical, bizarre, anti-Semitic conspiracy. They're deeply steeped into this, which is one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical about the uprisings, the future of the uprisings in the Arab world, because if you have a political dialectic in which neither side has any kind of sensible analysis of what's wrong in their societies, you're not going to get productive political outcomes. In the United States, you have Democrats, you've got Republicans, wherever you stand, they both are sort of approaching things from more or less the standpoint of planet Earth. But that's not true in the Arab world. And so this notion of Jews having no connection to the land, of having just sort of gotten off the boat from the Crimea or whatever, and taking the land has become absolutely pervasive. I can give you a million examples of that, but you can't deal with that narrative. You can't deal with people who are simply not operating in any kind of rational framework. David Brooks, whom I hate to quote, once made a point, I forgot what the context was, but he said, it's not that simply that the Muslim world and the West that they have different ideas. It's they have different ideas about ideas. And that's actually a very profound, no, actually it's a jejune and second-rate analysis, but David made it, and I thought I'd give him some credit. But that kind of gets to the heart of it. And by the way, one thing that's important is there are limits to, persuasion has its limits. There are people you can talk to. When I write my column, my wife is basically liberal. And I always try to write my column and think, I want to write a column which she's not necessarily going to agree with, but at least she'll say, okay, I can see that. That's the way, I don't want to preach to the converted. I want to write a column that's sort of reaching a little bit over to the other side and doing the best I can to at least stop and make them think. And I think I more or less succeed, in that. But there are people who you're never going to persuade. There are people in the BDS campaign who you will never win over because they're too invested or they're too stupid or one thing or another. And that has to be borne in mind, when you fight these battles. You're not going to win every single one of them. You're not going to win. All you want to do is win 51%. Or, in George Bush's case, 47%.
While you're arguing with some of these people that are somewhat more against Israel, do they ever give you good arguments, in fact, against Israel? What would be like an example of something that they're saying that is true and it's hard to argue against that Israel has done somewhat wrong?
Well, there are lots of cases that you can make. And the best cases actually come from, Israelis themselves, because there is a vibrant debate in Israel about, the fashlas, the screw-ups that Israel makes repeatedly. I, for instance, was a supporter of disengagement from Gaza. I thought it was a really good idea. Now I'm not so sure. Alternatively, I used to just sort of be opposed ideologically to an idea of a two-state solution. Now I'm pretty much in favor of it, with the caveat that I want something that works in practice, not just in theory. Now, as for Israel's die-hard opponents, no, I think they're completely insane. I concede nothing to them. There is, look, Israel's a democracy, and within any democracy, you have to take it as a given that there will be contending sides and disputes about what's wise and right. But whatever debates that I'm having with my friends who are either further to the left or further to the right of me, it's in the context of accepting that this is a legitimate state that is basically a good place. It's not in the context of having a debate with someone who says everything that Israel does is a crime, or that it's based on a crime, or anything of the kind. I can't have those. That's a different level of conversation. There is no conversation. Or it's a different level. Yeah, it's a different level of conversation. I mean, look, what am I supposed to concede? It's not a matter of pride. But even if I wanted to, even if I like strained and said, okay, well, Israel was really, wrong in 48 or 73 or 56, I can't see it. That's not to say Israel's a perfect state, but I can't see it.
I think that with the recent events in Tunisia and Egypt, that there's a risk that the American public will become more pro-Arab?
Look, the American public has been consistently pro-Israel since the very beginning. And, Oren's third book, was it second or third book, Faith, Fantasy, and Power, really was excellent in explaining, in sort of tracing the history of philo-Semitism in the United States. The Pilgrims saw themselves very much as like the new Hebrews. And the Puritan religiosity was obsessed with the Old Testament in the way that, say, Catholic religiosity was just more or less indifferent to the Old Testament. It's why you have New Canaan and Salem and all these places. So, I mean, the first part of the answer to your question is and something a lot of Jews don't understand is the depth of philo-Semitic feeling in this country, which is not just a function of Israel being a democracy, or it has to do with a religious perspective, which is quite powerful. James Madison had to failed out of his Hebrew classes at Princeton, and had to, I think, take another year at Princeton to qualify in Hebrew. So people forget. Just any of you go to Yale? Have you seen the inscription of the college? Now, would people become less pro-Israel if Tunisia, Egypt democratized? I don't think so. I think they just become more pro-Egypt and pro-Tunisia. I mean, people aren't sort of less pro-Canada because there's, Britain is a democracy or Australia is a democracy. Your sympathies just sort of rise in tandem with the quality of the state. Now, Israel might become less, or Americans might become less pro-Israel if, say, the Palestinians were suddenly to become a genuine progressive democracy, genuinely committed to peace and all the rest of it, and Israelis were to respond to that new reality by saying, screw you, we're going to continue to stay in the West Bank forever. But Israel wouldn't do that because Israel would respond to genuine Palestinian progressivism by, commensurately, by recognizing that this is a nation that we can live alongside. So no, I don't think that would be the result.
What do you think the effects of the rise of the politically conservative student movement, whether it's the growing contingent of young adults and students at CPAC, or the rise of alternative conservative papers on campus, or the rise of the Young Americans Foundation, will have an impact on the sort of environment on campus?
I don't know. Like the idea of being like a young college Republican is just so deeply terrifying. Like what went wrong in your life that this is what you're doing as a 19-year-old? I honestly don't know how to answer that because I follow that like not at all. I was just politically completely indifferent in college. But look, from the little I observed, you always get like on any campus, you're 100 or so young Republicans, and then you're X number of like trendy leftists, and then everyone else just doesn't really give a damn, which is one of the glories of the American educational system. So I don't see it having that much of an effect. That being said, let me make a sort of tangential point, which it might be relevant. The Jewish world, the organized Jewish world, basically has two sides. One is the world that is sort of about Jewishness, like birthright. It's like discovering an aspect of your Jewish identity. It's positive. It's, or federation, like being charitable giving in the Jewish world, or Aish, or, all this stuff, whatever it is, it's about that. There's one side. And then the other side is essentially the Jewish world fighting against anti-Semitism. So that's, or making the case for Israel and fighting its enemies. So that's like ADL and Camera and the Israel Project and the David Project and the, I don't know, whoever else project. Every rich Jewish donor who, just wants to fund a cause that's standing up to anti-Semitism. All that is great. It's important. It's necessary. But there is not a lot in the organized Jewish world which is a philo-Semitic Gentile world. And actually, that's a huge world. And, classic case. So I'm at some synagogue in Cleveland, and I'm giving a speech to like the usual synagogue crowd of like middle-aged elderly people. People show up for shul. And there's a reception kind of like this before my speech, and there's this one young Chinese woman who makes like a beeline for me. So, comes up to me, introduces herself. I forgot her name, but she's from Shanghai. She's getting her MBA at Case Western. So I said, so what brings you to this night's event? She said, we Chinese people know. Jewish people, smartest in world. And I said, well, I don't know about that. I mean, there are a lot of smart non-Jews, Chinese, Indians. No. Jewish people, smartest in world. Nobel Prize in Medicine, 42%. Nobel Prize in Chemistry, 33%. Nobel Prize in Physics, 37%. I'm probably not doing justice to her accent, but it was a very, pronounced accent. And I was just standing there, like, half embarrassed, like, no, we're not smart, we're really stupid, really, honestly. Anyway, the reason I tell that story is because, China, this minor, insignificant country of 1.3 billion people, rising global power, there's a hell of a lot of philo-Semitism in that country. Now, sometimes that's just based on taking anti-Semitic stereotypes and giving them a positive gloss, like, Jews, good in business, yes. But, South Koreans will often say, we're the Jews of Asia, because we care about education for our children, and we're academically excellent, we're entrepreneurial. Indians, another billion Indians, overwhelmingly, basically pro-Israel. Now, that's in part a function of Indians who hate Muslims, and so it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of deal. We don't do a lot to reach out to them. I get sent, various groups send me to college campuses. I go and speak University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Columbia. Now, I wish someone would send me to, like, the University of Nebraska, where I don't have to, like, fight a battle to make the case. You asked about the, college battles political battles on college campuses. What I'm saying is we ought to be reaching out to a large constituency of young people who don't necessarily have skin in the game, and they're persuadable, and they might just be interested, and you might just be able to do something positive with them that will have an impression for the rest of their lives. And finally, yeah.
Or people who have said that here, but you mentioned before that there's just no conversation often with the other side. So, you go to work every day, it's got to be frustrating. At the end of the day, you have moments where you're, this is certainly an uphill battle, but this is a losing battle. Who might convince it?
I would probably enjoy it more if it were a totally losing battle, because I'm a sucker for lost causes, which is probably not a good thing to say. But look, I'm basically an optimist, and quite frankly, as between talking to you all, who are more or less, I suspect, sympathetic to what I'm saying, and going to a college campus and getting the Muslim Student Association to show up, I mean, that is true joy. Because you're dealing with people who not only hate you, but they're stupid. And so you get this, like, Obi-Wan Kenobi moments in which you're like, these are not the droids you're looking for, That's actually kind of fun, and it's definitely fun when you go and the Palestine Solidarity Campaign shows up as they do, and it's I say, look, there's some people in this audience who frankly are going to agree with everything I say, but to those of you who are from the the Solidarity Campaign, I want to welcome you in particular. I'm glad you came. I take it the very fact that you came, that you're here, is that you're at least open to hearing my arguments. I'm totally willing to take questions from you after I'm done speaking. And really the point that I want to make to you is all of you, I am sure, consider yourselves like really good, progressive-minded people. And if that's your view, what I'm going to try to do in my speech is persuade you that you're mistaken in not supporting, at least at a fundamental level, not supporting Israel, opposing its right to exist, opposing its claims. You know, I had this experience about 2 years ago. After the war in Gaza, there was this horrendous short play that came out by a very fashionable feminist British playwright named Carol Churchill. It's called 7 Jewish Children. And to me, it was just a rankly anti-Semitic play. And of course, so it's some little crap theater on the Lower East Side agrees to produce it. And so I decided to go and see it for myself. Audience is maybe twice the size of this, maybe 3 times the size or so. And I sit there and I watch the play, which can be read in about 10 minutes. And then they decided they wanted an audience discussion. And so who's hosting the audience discussion? It's Alicia Solomon of The Nation and Tony Kushner, the author of Angels in America, Jewish-American playwright. And so, the audience discussion, which I would say is probably 95% ultra-left-wing Jewish. And so I'm like, oh no, this play is not anti-Semitic. It's about man's inhumanity towards man, or, blah, blah, blah. So finally I just raised my hand. I was called on, and I said, Mr. Kushner, I think it really took just guts, real courage on your part to bring this controversial play to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I just wanted to ask you, when do you plan to stage Angels in America at the Islamic University of Gaza? Just curious, landmark play about gay rights in America. Why not have it at the Islamic University of Gaza? You're so sympathetic. I didn't say that, but so I asked that, and there was like this big, booing of me. But again, I enjoy that. I like being booed. I'd be happier if you would boo me at the end of this talk. And so he said, well, because I'd identified myself as being from the Wall Street Journal, and kind of dismissed me. But afterwards, he came up. He's like, I don't understand your question. Why did you say that? I said, can I tell you, Tony, if I may call you Tony? I said, look, when they come for us, you're Jewish, I'm this right-wing conservative, you're really liberal, progressive, they're going to kill you first. And frankly, what I'm trying to do is stand up for your play and for your values and your whole idea of personal freedom. Because the truth is that in Israel, you can be a self-respecting gay man and a playwright and an artist and a political figure of extreme views, and no one is going to lay a finger on you. They're going to respect you, they're going to honor you, they're going to whatever, you're going to be treated as a celebrity. And the moment that you set foot in Gaza, they're going to kill you. He said, well, and then it kind of went on. He said, well, I don't know. I think we were very extreme. And so I said, look, how about we have a debate? And so for a while we were going to have a debate, but then he was working on some play in Minneapolis. And then, last year I debated Roger Cohen, the New York Times columnist in Washington. And, he thought he was going to crush me. He's Oxford educated. I'm like this schlemielish American. And I had loved it. I mean, I crushed him in the debate. You can see it on C-SPAN. He was completely stunned. So he asked me what keeps me going. It's like arguing with fools and winning. Improbably. It's a lot of fun, I'm debating Gideon Rose at the New York Historical Society in April, so if you want to come to that. I don't know. I'm kind of amazed that I have the privilege of doing what I do. And I feel like the purpose of being a columnist, of being a kind of a public, I don't want to say intellectual, but public talker aloud, is to wield your ideas in the service of what you think are great causes. And to me, there are a handful of great causes in the world. One of which is the success of what I believe is genuine liberalism for everyone, and the other is the survival and prosperity of the Jewish people. Why? Because I happen to be Jewish. Let other people wish for their own survival and prosperity. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, and it gets me up early every morning. Thank you.